Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Game of Thrones video on my thoughts on adapting unreleased novels. This video is to give some of my opinions based off of interviews and other facts given on just how the TV show Game of Thrones will move forward now that it has surpassed its source material. So I've heard from too many people and sources right before season 5 aired how Game of Thrones has now caught up to and would be moving past the books, but by and large this wasn't the case. Even the critic consensus for Game of Thrones season 5 on the Rotten Tomatoes websites reads, "Bloody action and extreme power plays return full throttle as Game of Thrones enjoys a newfound liberation from the world of source material, resulting in more unexpected thrills." No, not really. Sure, Game of Thrones Season 5 was the greatest departure from the books yet, but this has a lot more to do with something George R. Martin described years ago as the butterfly effect. That being, the longer the show went on, the more separate it would become from its source material, just because changes made earlier in the show will inspire more changes in later seasons, and those changes would inspire more changes later seasons, and so on and so forth. And what you have is a cumulative effect where the show becomes more and more different from the source material. However, season 5 overall was still pretty rooted in its source material of the released novels, Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, as all the major storylines that occurred this season are ones that readers had already seen played out years ago in the books. They've seen Cersei try to use the Faith Militant against the Tyrells only to have it backfire on her. They've seen Daenerys struggle to manage the city of Meereen as an insurgency group called the Sons of Harpy rises to challenge her rule. They've seen Ramsay marry someone with the name Stark in order to tighten the Boltons' hold on the north, while Theon discovers his true identity again. They've seen Prince Doran struggle with how to handle the Lannisters in King's Landing. They've seen Jon Snow struggle with his new position as Lord Commander, only to be betrayed by his own brothers because he chose to make peace with the Wildlings. They've seen Arya train to become a faceless man by trying to lose all sense of identity, only to be set back when she kills for her own personal purposes. They've seen Tyrion struggle with Jorah and with slavers as he tried to make his way to Slaver's Bay to meet Daenerys. So yeah, season 5 played out pretty much the same way it did in the books. Sure, there were many massive changes, more so than any other season, such as Tyrion actually meeting Daenerys, Jon Snow being involved in a battle with the White Walkers, Sansa being the one to marry Ramsay while Littlefinger returned to King's Landing, and Jaime going off to Dorne instead of the Riverlands. But all in all, these things happen in the chronological order of the events that occurred in books 4 and 5. The writers just chose to shake things up a bit by either having things happen that didn't happen in the books or by having them happen a bit out of order, which is nothing new. This is what they've been doing throughout the entire series run. The only storyline that can be said to have truly surpassed the books is that of Stannis Baratheon, as we saw him burn his daughter at the stake, and we saw his defeat at Winterfell, which led to his death. None of these things have happened yet in the books, and we're still not entirely certain they will, although I'd say it's a good bet that they will. So for the most part, Season 5 remain in the realm of the published books. Season 6 will not, though. Yes, there have been some rumblings from cast lists that Season 6 may swing back around to cover the Iron Island storyline that was in Book 4, and Arya and Samwell's storylines are still a tad bit behind, but for the most part, Season 6 will be branching out into new territory, and assuming George R. R. Martin doesn't manage to release the 6th book before the next season airs, Season 6 will mark the first time book readers and non-book readers will be on equal footing. David Benioff had this to say about it. Season 5 is still very much within the books for the most part. The very first scene of the season and the very last scene of the season are book scenes. It's more of season 6 that's going to be diverging a bit. So this seems to imply that if you think season 5 was different from the books, wait until you get a load of season 6. Now, I've watched too many videos and read too many reviews that seem to take up the attitude that Dan and Dave are pretty much in the same boat as everyone else when it comes to the unreleased novels, and that they'll just be making up their own story come season 6 because there's no novels to go off of. I've seen the comment multiple times saying, well, I hope the books get released before season 6 comes out so the showrunners can base their story off of it. First off, the scripts for season 6 are already written. TV and filmmaking, for the most part, is not an organic process. Scripts have to be written well in advance and then filmed and then edited and then all this other stuff added. Yes, there are some examples of scripts being written or rewritten during filming, but those are pretty unorganized projects. And to function in that way is very sloppy and tends to lead to disaster and disjointed storytelling. So in other words, it's not the norm, and that way of functioning is avoided whenever possible. So the scripts for season 6 are already written, so that ship has already sailed. Secondly, the showrunners are not as ignorant as everyone else when it comes to what will happen in the unreleased books. Dan and Dave and George R.R. Martin have been saying repeatedly in public appearances ever since the show first aired in 2011 that Dan and Dave are well aware of how George R.R. Martin intends to end his book series, and Dan and Dave have clearly stated that they intend to end the TV show in the same manner. Moreover, shortly before season 4 aired in 2014, Dan and Dave described how they met with George R.R. Martin for a week in Santa Fe and went over specifically how he intended to end the series so they could start planning how they were going to end the TV show. This is what David Benioff said about it. If you know the ending, then you can lay the groundwork for it. And so we want to know how everything ends. We want to be able to set things up. So we sat down with George R.R. Martin and literally went through every character and said, so what's the destination for Daenerys and for Arya? So Dan and Dave got as many details from George on what he planned on doing with the next 2 books as they could, so they could plot out how they were going to end the TV show. And this happened shortly before they started writing scripts for season 5. So I think they went into season 5 working towards this end goal, as they know they are in the back half of the overall story. However, as many are quick to point out, this doesn't mean Dan and Dave know exactly and precisely how every detail of the story will go, because George himself doesn't know. The next follow-up question the interviewer asked was, did you feel like he knew where he was going, or was he just figuring it out? To which D.B. Weiss replied, in some cases he had very definite ideas, and in other cases he had left those storylines more open for the time being. In a more recent interview with Dan and Dave from just before season 5 aired, they had this to say about it, quoting David Benioff, we've had a lot of conversations with George, and he makes a lot of stuff up as he's writing. Even while we talk to him about the ending, it doesn't mean that that ending that he currently has conceived is going to be the ending when it eventually writes it. And then D.B. Weiss added, it's like looking at a landscape and saying, okay, there's a mountain over there, and I know that I'm getting to that mountain. There's an event that's going to happen, and I know that I'm moving in that general direction of that event. But what's between where I'm standing now and that thing off on the horizon, I'm not totally sure. I'll know when I get there, and then I'll see what the terrain looks like around me, and I'll choose my path once I get closer to it. He figures a lot of this stuff out as he goes. He always says he's a gardener, not an architect. So my take on this is that Dan and Dave are aware of many of the landmark moments that will occur in the unreleased book, but some of these are subject to change, but the overall ending will likely be the same in both books and show. I look at it like a road trip that Dan and Dave and George R. R. Martin are on across the United States. They're taking different paths, but every once in a while they'll meet up. In fact, they've been on different paths from the very beginning. However, at the start, the paths crossed more often than not. But over the years, they slowly started to diverge more and more. I believe they're entering the realm of the unreleased novels will mark the biggest and sharpest divergence yet, but they will ultimately both arrive in LA. However, at the start, they may have been traveling along the East Coast, whereas now George is going to go through Texas and Tennessee, while Dan and Dave go up through Illinois and Minnesota. However, their paths will cross from time to time in all the big landmarks, be they St. Louis or Denver, and also Dan and Dave will be taking a shortcut, a quicker and more direct route to get to the final destination, whereas George is likely to do a lot more sightseeing along the way. To give a specific example of how this might play out, let's look at Sansa, whose storyline is already starting to diverge greatly. Just as an example, let's say that many, including myself, that speculate about Sansa sitting on the Iron Throne and being the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms at the end of the series comes to pass, just for argument's sake. Well, if that happens in the books, it will happen in the show as well. However, they may take completely and totally different paths to get there, such as in the show, maybe she rallies the North Lords to overthrow the Boltons and first becomes the Lord of Winterfell or possibly Queen of the North, whereas in the books, she never returns to the North and remains in the Vale and becomes a ruler in the Vale via marrying Harry the Heir. But her overall character arc in both cases would be similar and ultimately lead to the same end result. The show has already done this in many cases. They just take different paths to arrive at the same destination. Some examples are how Jorah was exiled by Daenerys for spying on her. In the book, she finds out because Barristan tells her when his identity is revealed, because Barristan was at all the small council meetings when they were talking about Jorah spying on them. However, in the show, Barristan was not in the small council, and he wasn't hiding his identity like he was in the books. So the way Daenerys finds out in the show is because Tywin Lannister slips Barristan the information that Jorah has been spying for them in order to undermine her. Or how both in the books and the show, Shae betrays Tyrion by testifying at his trial and then sleeping with his father. But in the books, Shae never really loved Tyrion and betrayed him when their relationship was no longer advantageous for her because she was just using him as a way to make money. Whereas in the show, they set up a situation where Shae really did love him, which created a totally different dynamic, but they arrived at the same destination through a different route by making her feel betrayed by Tyrion for trying to send her away. And there are many more examples to be had, but this effect is going to be much bigger and the differences more vast in the coming seasons, but all the same major beats will be hit. So, even if The Winds of Winter was released before Season 6 aired, it would have no effect on the scripts of the show at all, as I would guess none of the main plot points in that book will come as a surprise to Dan and Dave. Many of the details might, but they're going to be going on such a different path, the details won't matter. As Martin was deep into writing The Winds of Winter when D&D met with him, I'm sure they know most of the major points from the books, but not as much as they would know from the previous books. And book 7 is going to be even worse, as they will be working off a very vague outline. It sounds like to me that D&D met with George last year. They came up with their own outline on how to end the series based off the information they were given. So since they're going to get there first, I'm sure they have a much clearer picture of how they're going to end the show than George does of how he's going to end the books. So by the time the 7th book comes out, which probably won't be for like a decade or so, it's going to bear very little resemblance to the 7th season of the show. However, the show will definitely spoil major plot points of the ending that much has been made clear in interviews. In the Q&A session at Oxford this year, this is what David Benioff had to say about the show surpassing the books. Luckily, we've been talking about this with George for a long time, ever since we saw this could happen, and we know where things are heading. So we'll eventually basically meet up at pretty much the same place where George is going. There might be a few deviations along the route, but we're heading towards the same destination. I kind of wish that there were some things we didn't have to spoil, but we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. The show must go on, and that's what we're going to do. So this statement is contrary to the speculation I heard that D&D will completely make up their own ending, as he clearly states here, out of necessity, they're going to have to spoil things in the future books that they wish they didn't have to. However, in an interview George R. R. Martin gave this year at the Season 5 premiere, he seemed to have a more cavalier attitude about the show spoiling the books, as he said this: "The whole concept of spoilers is one I've never gotten. Yes, there's pleasure when you're reading a book or watching a television show, what will happen next, who will win, who will lose, but that is by no means the only reason to watch a movie or a television show. It's not the only reason to read a book. I read a lot of historical fiction, you know? I know who won the Civil War. It's not a spoiler to me, but I can still enjoy Gettysburg's even though I know how the battle came out. And I can still enjoy historical fiction about the War of the Roses, even though I know who won the War of the Roses. And for that matter, I still enjoy watching Citizen Kane every few years, even though I know Rosebud is the sled." As Weiss stated in a quote I cited earlier, Martin is more like a gardener and his writing is fluid. In an interview earlier this year, he talked about how he just came up with a major plot point in The Winds of Winter that will drastically change a character's storyline. It's a change, he mentioned, that will be precluded from happening in the show because the show has already done things differently, making it so this could not happen in the show. So I'm sure the ending could yet be different than he thinks it will be, but as producer Caroline Strauss mentioned at a Comic-Con panel this year, Dan and Dave do communicate with George R. R. Martin frequently about what to do with the show. So even though I'm sure they have their own outline as well, they could change it a little bit as well when they get updates from George. George has made it clear that he ultimately has no say in what the showrunners decide to do, as he has stated that if Dan and Dave wanted to put aliens in the show, he wouldn't be able to stop them. But he is a producer on the show, and from the sounds of things, he is consulted with. So D&D do seek his advice, but ultimately they do what they think is best for the show. And on that note, there's of course been a lot of bashing of Dan and Dave this past season due to the massive changes Season 5 has made. And a lot of people who have unrealistic expectations on how closely an adaptation should follow its source material tend to project their dissatisfaction with the show onto George. I even saw this ridiculous tabloid article that twists George's words out of context and tried to present it as if there was this huge feud between George and Dan and Dave, which is total nonsense. Although George's editor had many sharp criticisms of Season 5, when George was pestered about it from fans upset with some of the changes in Season 5, most particularly the show's decision to give Jane Poole's storyline to Sansa Stark, George felt compelled to respond, and his main response was "Leave me alone," that his blog was about the books, not the show, and if they wanted to talk about the show, there were many other appropriate places to do so, but he did also make a quick, vague statement about the changes overall. There has been many changes between the novels and the television show since the first episode of Season 1, and for just as long I've been talking about the butterfly effect. Small changes lead to larger changes, lead to huge changes. HBO is more than 40 hours into the impossible and demanding task of adapting my extremely lengthy and exceedingly complex novels, with their layers of plots and subplots, their twists and contradictions, and unreliable narratives. First, viewpoint shifts and ambiguous and a cast of characters in the hundreds, there has seldom been any TV series as faithful to its source material by and large. If you doubt that, talk to Harry Dresden fans or readers of the Sookie Steakhouse novels or the fans of the original Walking Dead comic books. But the longer the show goes on, the bigger the butterfly becomes. And now we have reached the point where the beat of the butterfly wings is stirring up storms, like the one presently engulfing my email. Prose and television have different strengths, different weaknesses, different requirements. David and Dan and Brian and HBO are trying to make the best television series that they can. And over here, I'm trying to write the best novels that I can. And yes, more and more they differ. Two roads diverging in the dark woods, I suppose. But all of us are still intending that at the end we will arrive at the same place. So the key phrase I take away from that is, there has seldom been any TV series as faithful to its source material. And that is a statement I would agree with, and while occasionally I may speak a little bit ill of those whom I deem book purists, who in my opinion do not understand the difficulties and intricacies of adapting novels into a different medium, especially novels like this, which George revealed earlier, the original intention of making the Song of Ice and Fire series as novels instead of a TV show, as he was working in television at the time. He came up with his idea was something to do that could not be done in television, and that could only be done in the written medium. In other words, the books were made to be unadaptable, and the fact that Dan and Dave managed to make one of the most popular and critically acclaimed TV shows out of it is no small feat. So I think people need to cut them a little frickin' slack. Of course, I myself do point out when I think they failed to live up to the potential of the source material, but I also point out the reverse when I think they expanded upon the source material. And even though I might complain here and there, overall, I'm in awe of what they managed to accomplish and think they managed to make one of the greatest TV shows of all time. But to be clear, I'm not knocking the opinions of those unhappy with the show and that prefer the books. Everyone has their own personal preferences. Some people may just prefer the written medium and George's original vision for the material, which is much more detailed and intricate. But personal preferences aside, the showrunners have done a damn good job of adapting the source material, and that's not an opinion, that's a fact proven by the popularity and critical acclaim the show has achieved. As for what George thinks of it, I'm sure he's irritated at certain changes the showrunners decide to make. And he keeps it to himself because he doesn't want to publicly badmouth the show. But I think all in all, he's happy with what they've done overall. And having worked in television himself, he understands the difficulties in adapting a novel, especially one as complex as this one. He has stated in the past that he was more discontented with the show, with what the show cut out rather than what it changed or added. He expressed extreme satisfaction with scenes that were added in the show that the books could not do because it didn't contain a viewpoint character. His favorite example is the scene where Bronn and the Hound have a go at each other shortly before the battle at Blackwater. But he did say it was unfortunate whenever they cut scenes or characters from the show, but overall understands why they feel they have to do that. The next couple of seasons will be something truly original, as it will mark the show moving beyond the books. Even if Martin does manage to release The Winds of Winter before season 6 is released, a possibility that seems less likely as time goes by, it will still be a season based off an outline rather than a completed book. And of course, this will get even worse come season 7. Personally, I'm looking forward to it. It will be good to be in uncharted territory and not have a bunch of book readers acting all smug to those who haven't read the books because they know what's going to happen next. I perfectly understand if anyone will choose not to watch the show in the next couple of seasons of Game of Thrones to avoid spoilers, but good luck with going on social media and trying to avoid spoilers altogether. So that's it for my thoughts on adapting unreleased novels. If you haven't noticed, I have been doing a Season 5 recap video every Monday. This video was the last in the series. Next Monday I'm starting a new segment called Quick Review, where every week I release a short video reviewing a TV show that is currently airing on TV. And by currently airing, I don't mean it's necessarily on at this particular moment. It may be in hiatus, but it hasn't completed its run yet. These reviews will be spoiler free, so intended for those that maybe haven't seen it and are trying to decide whether or not to watch them. I have about 9 of these planned, and once I finish those, I plan on starting in on a series of Season 6 prediction videos to be released every Monday. But it probably won't be until at least October until I actually get to doing those. In the meantime, I'll continue with my normal rotation, which I try to release videos for every Thursday and Saturday. And my normal rotation goes 1 Star Trek video, 1 Game of Thrones video, and 4 random videos. So you will get more Game of Thrones content on Enchantment of Eternity over that time as part of that rotation. So make sure you subscribe to keep up with all that, and thanks a lot for watching.